what is one thing that motivated you? Like, what was the decision? What made you go to this decision of wanting to work specifically with quilts and demonstrating quilts?
Um, for me as an artist, I'm always looking for materials that have some type of energy or weight or gravitas to them. You know, it's one thing to have a blank canvas and then create an artwork, and that's fine. And I've done that, and that's something I also admire as well. But early in evolving as an artist, I started to gravitate more towards objects and themes that had, you know, like hidden meaning or more weight than just what you're seeing. So for me, using antique quilts was a way of literally taking the material of American history and manipulating it through collage and painting and rejuxtaposition to create new works that stand alone as artworks. And you can see them just as artworks. But when you start to dig the layers and peel the layers back, you start to see a larger dialogue that spans many centuries, because most of these quilts that I use are pre-1900. And you start to think about the time when they may have been made. Who may have made them? Typically groups of women or maybe an individual. And then you start to think of the art history of the quilt in America and how it has always been seen as what they say is a domestic object or a cultural object and not an art object. And I always thought that that language was divisive. And it was a way of sort of saying that the work that we have attributed to women was not of the same merit as, you know, a man putting some paint on a white canvas and throwing it in a museum. So I went to an exhibition at the Whitney in the early 2000s, which was called The Quilts of Gee's Bend. And Gee's Bend is an area in the South where a group of women have been making a very specific type of quilt aesthetic for, you know, close to 100 years now. And that work was in the same museum as, you know, Picasso's and Jackson Pollock and Frank Stella and so on. And the work held its own. You know, you really didn't have to read into it to see that this work was as good, if not better, than some of those paintings that we consider to be treasures. And I thought that that was an interesting sort of political statement, that now you have a group of Black women, unknown for the most part, with their work in this, prestigious museum. And I started to think about quilts a bit more. And when I started to research them, I read stories about how quilts may have been used on the Underground Railroad as signposts. So as escaping enslaved people were going from the South to the North, if they came up to a safe house that had a certain quilt or a certain pattern, they might be able to read certain directions and secret codes from that quilt to help them on their journey to freedom. So I thought, what would happen if I take quilts that people were throwing away or getting rid of, and then breathe life back into them, add new layers of code into them from my perspective, from today's perspective. And what does that mean to that quilt? Well, then that quilt now becomes a palimpsest or a marker of history, because you've had hands over centuries of time work on it. So, you know, we see it as we see it today, but imagine someone else seeing these quilts 70 years from now and how they would read those layers of code and markings and images. So that's why specifically I started working with the quilts, because I liked it had all that historical baggage to work with.
I'm Jasmine. So a question I have, like, along with like the quotes, so how long does it take you to create a piece? Or like, if there's like one piece in particular that took you like forever to do, like which one was it?
It totally ranges. I've had pieces that I started 5 or 6 years ago that I still haven't finished because I just can't figure it out. I kind of can't unlock the piece. And the more I work on it, the worse it gets. So I have to just put it aside for several months and then try to come back at it. The good thing about working with quilts, I mean, patchwork quilts in specific, is because the idea is that it's patchwork. It's made of a bunch of other pieces. So sometimes I might take a quilt that has defeated me, and then I have to cut it apart and then use it on another quilt. So there's this sort of regenerative process. Sometimes the ideas come very quickly, and they come from weird places. Sometimes I might hear a phrase, and then I think of a title, and then I think of an image that works with that, and I can just do it immediately. Other times I have to sit with the quilt for many days, weeks, or months before I can make one mark. And then when I make that mark, I have to figure out what happens next. And then it becomes an improvisation and a back and forth. I often talk about the quilts almost as if they're living, because some of them are easy to work with and some of them are difficult to work with. You know, some of them fight back, some of them are ready to be shaped into whatever you want them to be. So after working on so many, I've developed a language and certain strategies to help myself out of holes and corners that I may have painted or worked myself into. And, you know, if we get really, really technical one day, I tell you the way I see them, that I'm working in like maybe 5 or 6 different modes per, you know, with all the quilts. Like some have figures, some are totally abstract, some are additive, meaning I'm putting on tar and glue and paint, and some are reductive where I'm just cutting things out. So I sometimes set up different challenges of how I'm going to work on them and then try to figure out the piece that way. So it varies, it totally varies. It takes a lot of patience.
Consider your work African or due to how big a role clothing patterns have in African traditions?
Yeah, I consider them to be part of the African diaspora. So not specifically African, but definitely borrowing ideas that I've seen in African art. And not just visually, but more conceptually, using fabrics and putting different elements together in certain type of collage assemblies to make the work. I also consider it part of an African diasporic tradition to take discarded material and to repurpose discarded material. I think about a lot of pattern play that I see in West Africa, of mixtures of different patterns, apply it onto other patterns, and how it makes no sense, but it makes total sense. And in fact, that's really a philosophical approach that I use with the quilts, because you know, I came up in a time when I was studying that everyone was into minimalism. Everything was stark, you know, flat colors and so on. And I wanted to do something that was totally different than that. So there, you know, there's a conceptual philosophical approach to being what we call a maximalist, where I'm like, I'll put everything and the kitchen sink into a work and try to find some harmony in that. And that's an aesthetic that I sometimes have seen when I've been in places like Ethiopia or Senegal, where, you know, somebody has just a combination of things together on their truck, or they're wearing it, but the way they put it together has a style that you can't deny. You know, something like, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense, even though I would never have thought about it that way. When I work on the quilts, like even the one that you see behind me, there's no reason why all of that should ever go together, but somehow I find a way to try to make it all go together.
My question was, what's your favorite piece and what was the process like?
I don't have one favorite, but I have personal relationships with several of them. And I find different things that I like, or that I learned, or that I needed to go through from each piece. Even the one behind me right now is actually one of my current favorites. You can't see the whole piece, unfortunately, but the quilt itself is cropped in a way that's very different than the other ones I've worked with. And this combination of things in the center actually makes a silhouette of a figure. And I know most people don't get that, but they sense that there's a figure there. And I like that this is very ambiguous, that it feels like total abstraction, but at the same time, you're getting a figurative element, but you can't pin down what any of the parts are. And that's sort of the goal that I'm trying to get to, where you're getting impulses from a lot of different directions, but you can't put a finger on it, which makes you keep searching and keep checking and fact checking and referencing things in your head. So I think that's sort of the sweet spot that I'm trying to get to. So this one behind me actually does that. But with the same, in the same breath, I can say there's other pieces. Like I have a piece called The Talk that's at the Bronx Museum, which is like a black and white pattern quilt. And it has what looks like 4 figures standing, and they're made in white and black striped fabric. And behind them is a shadow that's made out of tar and has glitter on it. And I like that because it's just so simple, but it's very mysterious and enigmatic. So I like when there's aesthetic things that keep my visual and creative interest, but then when there's a different feeling that comes out when the piece is done and other people get something different from it. So yeah, sorry, I don't have one favorite one, but I have, you know, I have a few that I like and a few that I'm still trying to negotiate. We're still in talks. We're trying to work it out. And also what I like about this piece is it's called The Talk. And, you know, this is something that not every art viewer is going to understand, but The Talk, for many of you, you may understand this, is the talk that, children of minority children, brown children, black children, women, female, all get a talk at certain points of their life of things you have to watch out for in society. And this talk specifically is usually the talk that you have about the police. It's called the talk. We always call it the talk. Have you had the talk with your kids yet of how they have to address the police, which is different than some of their friends may have to address the police. So there's a political undertone in that. But if you don't know that, it's just called a talk, and it's very enigmatic. But I like that if you were standing there next to 3 or 4 different people, all of you might be getting different readings and different understandings of this piece, and that you can have an informed and interesting dialogue from your own points of view.
A question that I really had, I feel like I have with like any artist, was like, how did you get into like the art world and like get your first break or get connections? Because like I can't like imagine it. Like I make art and I know people, but I don't know how the art world works.
I think it's different for every single person, and that's why the art world is as strange as it is. One might expect me to say my first break came when I got to New York and someone gave me a show, but really what I would consider my first break was when I was probably 9 or 10 years old. I grew up in LA, and I started doing graffiti, graffiti murals on the streets in LA late at night. And I got busted by the cops. And they took me down to the station, but they didn't arrest me because my parents came in there and they realized, they were just feeling nice that day, whatever. They let me go. So this is in LA when I was a kid. And after that, like a week later, I applied and was accepted into the advanced placement painting class at my high school. Junior high school, it was around then. But I got put into an advanced art class. And so now I'm still doing art, but obviously it's not on the street walls in the middle of the night. But it didn't really change anything for me. I was still having a place where I could be creative and have a creative output. But from that, I met a teacher who put me in a contest, and then I won that contest. And I did a small exhibition when I was, somewhere in my teens. And not that that necessarily changed everything in my life, but it made me feel validated that, where I was spending all this time and energy was actually turning into something that somebody wanted to see. And that was the kind of inspiration that sort of kept me going and going. So it wasn't the break that, got me to where I am now per se, exactly, but it's one of the many, many rungs on the ladder that got me here. So don't sleep on how small the encouragement is or where it comes from. Every little bit counts. And to be a good artist, to be a good creator, to be a good person is to be able to discern and know how to understand when you're given a gift or given encouragement or inspiration, because it can come from anywhere, from all kinds of strange sources. It could be just that one person walking down the street who noticed that one thing you did that day. And that makes you sort of remember, yeah, I did this for a reason. It's a unique expression of my being. And if I continue that, more people might see that and it might become its own thing. So I think there were several incidents like that in my youth that sort of put me on the path of continuing to be an artist, never being so discouraged that I stopped.
Good afternoon. So my question is, like, I really love, each and every like piece that you make, especially the color choices and how you like have different color variations. I wanted to know if like the meanings of each color that you choose, like, how do you choose your colors? Do you choose them with intentions? For example, the piece called Horizon, I really love like the splash of different like patterns and colors, and I wanted to know like what intentions you had to choose them.
I'm going to use a musical metaphor for this. I sometimes think of colors and combinations of colors like chords, like a musician would hit a chord, several notes at once to create some type of sound. And since I'm using used quilts, I'm sort of using what is already around me, what I have access to. So there's some quilts that are literally, in my impressions, are ugly. But when that happens, that I'm saying that's the piece I need to work with, because it's going to push me to try to do something to bring it into a different, to make me feel, you know, to change it so that I feel differently about it. And that sometimes comes with, the reason I use the chord analogy is if I take that ugly pattern and then I find another one that I do like, and then another tiny color element over here, if I put those three together, what happens? And then you start to see interesting relationships form. So that influences my color decision a lot. It's really, that is totally like an intuitive process for me. I don't plot that out. I don't do color charts. I do none of that. I just really react to the patterns, and I consider that to be the moment of improvisation where I could like really have total freedom of putting and mashing things up together that may or may not work. So then when I start to paint directly on them, then I'm sometimes either trying to accentuate something that's already there or to totally deny and contrast something that's there. And once again, I'm thinking of chords. You have a discordant chord, or you have a major chord, something that sounds like it makes sense, and then something that sounds a little dissonant and a little bit off, but it makes you linger. So I'm really trying to get into the real modalities of how the colors and patterns play with each other. A lot of it is about vibration, retinal, you know, getting your retina to vibrate at certain color pitches and certain repetitions of patterns and colors and markings. So it's sort of subconscious stuff happening, but it happens on a deeply retinal optical level. And yeah, I mean, that inspires me. Just talking about that makes me want to make some work. But that's one of the most fun parts, is just sort of finding those strange, surprising combinations.
Yeah, I really loved how you explained that. I recently, took a jazz class at school, and we were like talking about improvisation, and I'm learning how to improvise, a
There you
song,
go.
which like it made it really clear when you were explaining how you choose your colors. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say to anybody, there's a couple of like little sayings that I have in my head all the time. Is, when you think you've made a mistake on a drawing or a painting or a sculpture, that's probably the learning moment. And it might shut you down. It might shut you down for a few days or weeks, like, oh, I killed this thing, I can't do it, I ruined it. But go back to it at some point, because if you can get yourself out of that area that was problematic before, then you have sort of elevated your game. You've stepped up, you've realized that, you know what, all those things that I thought were mistakes were actually the exact right move, because it led me to making these discoveries and finishing the work in this way. So I would say looking at what you consider a mistake as an opportunity. And I think that goes into improvisation as well, because you don't know what's going to come out of your bandmate's instrument. They may not even know what's coming out of it. But your job is to figure out how to counter it or how to roll with it so that something interesting happens. And to do that, you have to be totally present in the aesthetic that you're working, in the form that you're working at.
My name is Linda. And I wanted to ask you, what was the exact moment that you realized that art was for you, and that, you weren't questioning it anymore, and that it was serious to you?
It was around that time that I was saying before, that I got put into that art class. And then around a year later, these teachers asked me to put a bunch of my pieces in the lobby of the school. And they just started an exhibition program. They didn't have one before. And I don't think they started because of me. Maybe they were thinking about it, but I was asked to be one of those participants. And I mean, that was sort of a huge thing. I didn't expect it. I didn't even know to want something like that to happen. But they're like, well, you've got these 10 things, we'd like to show them. So I was like, okay, that's cool. And once I did that, and people were asking me about the work, and I was like, oh, this is sort of cool. I'm able to communicate all these ideas because people were inspired enough by the work to ask the question. And then soon after that, I was in another contest. It was a national contest, and I ended up winning as one of the painters from Los Angeles. And I was flown out to Washington, D.C. to compete against other artists from all around the nation. And I didn't win that, but once again, I won my city and I was invited there. So that alone was sort of like an encouragement and a validation that whatever I'm doing, people are seeming to pay attention to this, that there's something here. So I just kept working and kept working. And even when I went to college, I went to a liberal arts school. I went to Morehouse College in Atlanta, and it's not known for art at all. In fact, they didn't even have an art program when I went there. but I was a little reticent to try to go into an art school because I thought I would burn out. So I went to a liberal arts school and ended up becoming an art major there. And that also worked out for me because there were so few students interested in art that one of the art teachers that was there took me under his wing and started taking me out to exhibitions and to student competitions. So I was competing against people who were like 5 and 10 years older than me as an artist when I was probably 19 or 20. And it just felt natural. I was just sort of following the work. The work was leading me to these situations. I was not plotting it, but I was just dedicated enough that, you'll see this. When you're dedicated and you're really putting that work in, people around you notice that. And your teachers and your friends and those people who are there for you, they will push you forward. They will. They will see the things that you might not even see at that point. And then one day you'll get to that consciousness like, you know what, this thing is happening and I'm on it. And, it's already in you. You just keep pushing forward. And, it might take a long time. I mean, I still have much to achieve, but gradually things start to come your way and doors start to open.
The question I'll choose to ask you, it's an interesting question. I like to ask all sorts of creators. What are your art horror stories, if you have any, and how are you able to deal with it?
Art horror stories. Oh my God. I'd have to really go back into the archives, but I was in a nightmare state for a good few years when I first started showing professionally, semi-professionally, and professionally, because I won't say that I'm a procrastinator, but I think inspiration comes to me at weird times and usually not on everybody else's schedule. So there were many installations and exhibitions where I just assumed I was able to stay in the gallery and the museums and the spaces as long as I needed to complete the work, as opposed to having to leave at 5 and then come back the next morning at 7. So there were many arguments and situations where I literally had to flex as hard as I could to stay in these galleries to finish works that, of course, they thought were already going to be finished, but I was there creating and making them on the spot. And when I say that it was a series of nightmares, it was like every exhibition, the opening starts at 6. I'm finishing the work at 4. I haven't slept for 3 days. I'm going to a back room and crashing on the floor, getting up, throwing water on my face and changing a shirt so I can go meet people. So there was like no distance between making the work and showing the work, no time to understand it and live with it. It was just go, 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 go. And it took me years to sort of like change my patterns enough so that I could be in a better position when those installations were happening. But I didn't see it as a nightmare, but it drove people crazy who I was working with. And I was definitely in a very high stress state doing that for so long. So I would say that's one of the nightmares. And then there's nightmares when, you try to do something and it doesn't work. You're experimenting on site and it does not work. Because I work in a lot of different medium. It's not like I'm just making paintings that I could take someplace and hang up. Sometimes I'm doing an installation that has video and sound and moving parts. You never know what's going to happen with those things until they are really road tested. And anything before road testing, they can fall apart right in front of your face. So I've had, installations that I was like, oh, it's going to be great. All this thing is going to happen. And then it didn't happen. And you're just like, well, let's just try to turn the lights down on this section of the room and highlight the other side of the room where everything is working and going fine. But, it's par for the course. Everyone does a bad gig.
But yeah, I could also really relate to what you said about being, procrastinating and stuff like that. I do that a lot. And I find myself up at like 4 a.m. still coloring in some of my drawings. And I'm like, whoa, I have school tomorrow. I gotta go to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's just a part of art and stuff like that. You always get inspiration at weird times. But a question I had is that a lot of your pieces are very complex and like you have to really look at it for a long time to get some idea out of it. So I wanted to know, like, when you have like certain meanings and like hidden messages, wherever you was, like subliminal messages within the art, like how long does it take you to think about it and get that idea onto the material?
Yeah, my mind just works that way. I think if I see a vision in my mind, that's one thing. My next process is like, well, what does that mean? Well, what does every element mean? Well, what does the combination of those things mean? Well, what's the history of that image? Well, how does that work? Well, that's interesting. Well, what if you change this a little bit? Now you're disrupting the history and the sort of lineage of that image, and that changes the meaning. Not everyone's going to get that, I understand, but some people will get that. And that's what it's for. It's for those people who are really willing to put the time in there to get the extra information. And I don't expect everyone to get everything. I used to. That was one thing that I learned I could not control, early on, enough where it didn't depress me. But, let's face it, everyone's going to view any piece of work through their own lens and through their own experiences. So we can't assume that they'll understand everything. And that's fine. I think it should be a creative relationship when somebody looks at your work. If you're just going to tell them everything that's in the work, then you might as well say it to them rather than depict it. But I like the layered approach because I like a gift that keeps giving, so that it's not ever just a quick read. And the more you become experienced with seeing my work, like if you go to the Brooklyn Museum and see another one of my pieces that's not a painting, you're already trained to know that I know he's probably got 10 other things happening in that piece. Let me look a little closer and a little closer. I mentioned challenges earlier, and they say that the average amount of time spent looking at an artwork in a museum is something like 2 or 3 seconds. That's nothing. So then the challenge becomes, how do you make someone stay there for longer than 3 seconds? And for me, it's by sort of loading it with all this other content. Also, I think that, for me personally, I'm dealing with obviously aesthetics, but I'm dealing with art history. I might be dealing with social history. I'm dealing with a lot of things as I put my imagery and my materials together. And I like once again, if there's a group of 5 or 6 people looking at it, everyone's bringing their own experiences. I would love for each of them to get one strong feeling that's different than the other so that they have a conversation. They're like, oh, I never saw that, or I didn't think about that. So you've expanded everybody's visual literacy and expectation from the work. So that's one of the reasons I do it. But those layers and those references can come very, very quickly. After working as long as I have, it's just second nature for me to embed it in the work and to make them deceptively seductive, because it is a visual thing first and foremost. But after that, the layer below that is heavy content usually.
How long has it been since you started quilting specifically? And do you gravitate more towards quilting and kind of do your other pieces sometimes, but not as frequently?
That's really a good question. So first clarification, I'm not quilting all those quilts. So, because that would be a lifetime. I'm taking already made quilts, usually the ones that are being thrown out or that people are giving away or handing down or whatever. And then I work on those as a backdrop and, combine various quilts and painting and so on directly onto those. But I started that specifically. I started because I was invited to be in an exhibition in Philadelphia. And the idea was several artists were going to Philadelphia to look at these landmark sites that have started to go into ruin and that people weren't paying attention to anymore. And we were going to do installations in those various sites. And while I was there doing research, I started just somehow ending up being attracted to and researching quilts. And then I found out there were all these underground railroad stations in Philadelphia, some of them that still had historic markers and some that people didn't realize were there. So I ended up making a map so that people could travel and find all the underground railroad houses. But then I embedded the map into a quilt to play with the idea of the coding. And that's sort of how it started. But I really got deep into it when it was around 2011, and I had 3 major solo exhibitions, 2 in New York and 1 at Massamoka, which is this humongous space in northern Massachusetts. And I did a lot of work, huge installations, huge sculptures. I mean, it was ridiculous, the amount of work and, the stress and the late nights and the not sleeping and staying all night to the installations, all that stuff was happening. And when the shows were done, I was pleased with them. And, I got some good reviews, and I wasn't really working with too many galleries. Some work sold, some work didn't sell. But I was so spent, I was so burned out after, whereas I was like, I've got to find another way to work because I can't put that much effort in all the time. Because I'm working with teams of engineers, and there's lots of meetings to even do some of those pieces. I wanted to work on something in my studio by myself. So the quilts, I was like, let me revisit that quilt installation I did. And that's when I started to work on the quilts, because it was something I could do on a daily basis by myself. And that's how that started. So, sorry, that was a long form answer to what you're saying. I wouldn't say quilts are my go-to or my favorite to do, but they are my most immediate and the most that's in my sort of daily routine to do. But that's usually interspersed with larger installations and exhibitions that I'm working on. So I'm working on a body of marble sculptures right now. I just had a show in Chelsea that closed a few weeks ago that was mostly marble sculptures, and there was 2 or 3 quilts. So the quilts, the language that's inside the quilts can also live outside the quilts, sometimes in objects. So I started to work on these marble pieces, and I have a major project about to open at Rockefeller Center in the spring that you'll all be able to see. And that will be more sculpture installation. There'll be some augmented reality, and there'll probably be some quilt references there too, but it won't be all quilts. So you sort of get a larger palette of what I'm working with.
So do you prefer to, I'm guessing like you prefer to work more alone than in big groups of people?
I really prefer to work alone, like so much so that it's almost problematic. It's like, I just don't want anyone near me when I work. And it's always been like that. It's just, it's a real sacred space for me. And I've had to figure out ways just to even get work done where I've had to allow people to be in the studio with me. And I actually do really fine with it once I get it set up. But when I'm mentally preparing for people to come in when I'm working, I'm a mess. I'm just mad. I just don't want anyone there. And then, they're there for 30 minutes. I'm like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you guys are here. Thank you for the help. And then the minute they're gone, I'm locking all the doors and I'm like back in my bubble. So yeah, I prefer to work alone, but the reality is I can't always work alone, and I've figured out ways to cope. All right, what about you? Do you like to work alone, or do you like to work with people?
I like to work alone when it comes to art, but when it comes to like other stuff, like I like having company sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My name is Samiha, and my question was, is there any specific figure that like really inspired you and your art style, or motivated you to continue creating your art?
Yeah, there's several. David Hammonds is one. The artist David Hammonds, the artist Terry Atkins. Those are 2 guys that have always been really sort of inspirational to me. Yeah, I mean, there's so many. There's just like almost too many for me to name. But rather than the specific artist, it's more so the similar traits you would find in all the people who really inspire me are the ones who never rest on their laurels. They don't just find one way of working and stick to that. They're always pushing and experimenting and pushing it further. So even when they fail, for me, sometimes that's really inspirational because they were willing to do that. I'll be using another music metaphor, and this might be controversial for some, I don't know. Kanye West, not necessarily my favorite performer, but one thing I do admire about him is he's willing to put pretty much anything out there. He will do an album that's like a mega smash, he's at the award shows, blah, 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 and then he'll turn around and do an object that is totally a passion project that nobody digs. And then 4 or 5 years later, you hear all these people making knockoffs of that work. And once again, not that he's my favorite performer or anything, but I do like the fact that he takes risks, whereas most people in his position would not take a single risk at all. They'd keep making the same thing as long as they can make it. And then when they have to change, they check in with the consultants to see what's the right change to keep that demographic, which is very different than someone who's like, you know what, I did all that. I'm going to do my Miles Davis thing now and turn my back and plug my instruments in and just flip the whole thing, on its side. And if you love it and you stay with me, I love you too. And if you don't, so be it. The art has to progress. So I like people who take risks.
My question is, whenever you are struggling to find inspiration, is there a place that you can just retreat to and that will assist you in finding something to create?
Yeah, for me, nature, walking around in nature, walking around on the beach, sometimes just walking even in the city, taking myself totally out of my studio, out of the art realm, and just become an observer of things happening around me. And sometimes it's reading, sometimes it's listening to music, sometimes it's a phrase that I might hear that just starts, the machinery going again, and I get an inspiration. I basically translate whatever inspired me and try to find a way for it to enter into the art stuff. But it's a thing that I've had to learn over many, many years, is that taking breaks is as important as working. And I'm a student of Buddhism, and we all are familiar with an idea of meditation, but there's various types of meditation. There's actual seated meditation, there's walking meditation, there's eating meditation, there's breathing meditation. So the creative process could be literally you in a studio working, but that creative process could also be you at the lunch, at a cafe, well, when we could do that kind of thing, looking at people and listening to the conversations that are happening around you. You end up becoming a sponge. And that's another thing that a creator has to be. We can put a lot of stuff out, but we also have to take a lot of stuff in. So exercising that sponge side of the equation is super important. And if you're in a real creative block, maybe you just turn that off and don't be so hard on yourself. Maybe that's your moment to be a sponge and you just let it all come in. I went to graduate school for painting, and I forgot what year, but I went to graduate school for painting. I didn't paint a single painting the entire time I was in graduate school. I started experimenting with sculpture and sound and video. I came out of grad school, moved to New York, and started showing. Still no paintings. I went literally probably 12 years before I did another painting. The quilts are the paintings. Prior to that, it was all three-dimensional, all installation, video, performance work. But that time, I was thinking about painting, whether I was consciously doing it or not, thinking about the things I liked and things I didn't like, until I could figure out a time and a way of working that made sense for me in terms of painting. And that's where the quilts came in. So, this is a long process of being a creator. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So it goes up and down, but you just got to ride it through.
That was a great answer. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And also, can I ask, do you have any books that you would recommend? Like some books that have really influenced me in your life?
Yes, I have two. Both very simple, very quick reads. And many of you may have read one of them. One is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. You can find it pretty much anywhere. It's a quick read. You can finish it in a day, but read it mindfully. Listen to what the real messages are behind it when you read it. So that's Siddhartha, Siddartha, by Hermann Hesse. And the second one is a book which will be a little harder to find. It's called Wabi Sabi, Wabi Sabi. Wabi Sabi is a Japanese principle and that came about in the study of Zen, but also the study of the tea ceremony, which is a very important part of Japanese culture. And the Chinese also have a very elaborate tea ceremony as well. And back in history, the Japanese, of course, were trying to distinguish themselves from being, just clones of China. And in their tea ceremony, they developed an aesthetic that was very contradictory to the Chinese tea ceremony. Chinese tea ceremony was also adopted from the British. So there was very ornate porcelain ware that's gilded and highly detailed. And the Japanese said, you know what, we're going to go a different direction. We're going to make these earthen bowls and cups that are a little wobbly and the glazing is a little off and all this other stuff is happening. And if you're looking at the Chinese and the British stuff, you're saying that's perfect. And if you're looking at the Japanese stuff, you're saying that's a little wonky and strange. But the wabi-sabi philosophy is that the nature of the materials is the only true perfection. And if those materials want to droop and they want to sag, or they want to drip and they want to bleed and go this way, then that is true perfection. And you let the nature of those materials decide how they want to be. And for us to be perfect viewers means we can understand that and we don't impose our will on that object. So that's part of the wabi-sabi philosophy. It's also about the beauty in things that most people think are not beautiful. So for me, it's the used quilt that has the tears and the rips and, you know, the discoloration. There's something actually beautiful about that because it speaks of its history, where it's come from, who it's been around, the hands that have touched it. That's powerful. If it was pristine and new and just came out of a box, it would have none of that energy on it. So wabi-sabi is a way of sort of seeing the deeper essence of things beyond the surface.
For youth who are getting started with art, who might see their art, which is really beautiful, as just a hobby, as something that just sits in their desk but doesn't like leave. Do you have any advice for folks who might have issue accessing resources, or folks who might have an issue or have trouble just talking and sharing their work?
Yeah, I would say look for art classes. You know, there's always, and New York City has some, I mean, you know, everything's off now. I mean, they might be doing remote versions of that, but typically there's a lot of the museums have classes. Cooper Union used to have the Saturday program where New York high school students can go there on Saturdays for free and take art classes. There's art discussion groups at a lot of museums. If you have friends that are artists, ultimately you guys are going to be your best cohort because you're going to be watching out for each other and you're going to be watching out for opportunities. So if 3 or 4 of you are like, we're dedicated artists, talk to yourselves about your work. Have sessions where you talk about and get into the deep meanings of your work and constructively criticize each other, make each other better artists, and then expand that group. There are other artists out there that are looking for the same thing. I would always say that artists are, number one, our best own resource because we can't always depend on it coming from outside sources. It is very tricky right now, obviously, due to COVID, but as I say that, maybe there's another opportunity there because there's probably like-minded people around the world right now who are on a Zoom who are sharing their work. All you have to do is spend some of that time you're on the internet and look and see where those groups and those group chats might be. They must be out there. And if not, start one. That way you're not just talking to the people, your folks and your friends in the Bronx, but you're worldwide at that point. You can really have a conversation. But all that is to sort of reaffirm that, you know, we are our best resource at the end of the day. So other resources, YouTube. If you're looking for a technical question or you have an issue doing your watercolor, or you want to know how to keep your paper flat, YouTube. You know, so those are the easy free ones that you can go to and get something like that. Ask your instructors. For me, you know, I went to Saturday classes of art at the local museum when I was a kid. That was the first thing. And then a friend of the family introduced me to an art instructor at another school that I didn't go to, who gave me some lessons. You know, it was a total patchwork and mix of a network to get me where I am. And when you get to a certain point where you can start showing, take every opportunity you can to do that, because you'll learn more about how to present your work. You'll meet more artists, you'll meet more curators, you'll meet more collectors.
I just wanted to say one quick thing. Sanford, we're curating a show, and we're actually including your Afropic piece.
Okay.
The one that, the very tall one.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
Yeah, it's going to be opening at the museum in a few weeks. They are curating a show from the Bronx Museum's collection.
Got it.
So
Yes, that's right. Yes. Good, thank you.
Before you sign off, do you mind telling us a little about the work?
Oh, the Afropic?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that Afropic, they're actually, so I was invited to do a project at a museum at Princeton. And the idea was they invited 3 objects. It was Ai Weiwei, myself, another woman named Ellen Harvey, and Alice Shu. It was 4 artists. And we were invited to just go through the existing encyclopedic museum collection and make work based on things that were there, or to rearrange stuff in that collection. And I chose 3 sections. I chose the Renaissance section, the Greco-Roman section, and African pre-Columbian section. And I made up a whole narrative of the Afro pick as a sacred object. So I got some purple, some rosewood, and literally carved an Afro pick. And I put it in the museum next to an object from the 6th century, from Suriname, from the 6th century. And I wrote museum text that sort of said, well, you know, the people in Suriname at this point had afros. How else were they going to comb their afros if they didn't have an Afro pick? So I made this little Afro pick with a fist on it. And after I made it, I did a sketch of it and ended up doing that large etching of that piece that I made. So that's a rendering of a sculpture that I made. So it's a reverse thing. I didn't do the sketch and then make the sculpture. I made the sculpture and then made the sketch. And we printed that out and made that oversized etching. And I did it in a Japanese technique. I just moved, I lived in Japan for 3 years in the 90s. And when I moved back, you know, I started doing some woodblock carving when I was there and when I was in the city and had the opportunity. Yeah, so that's a woodblock carving. So the original plate to make that is a huge 6-foot piece of wood that I hand carved, and then we inked it and ran these prints from it. And that red insignia at the bottom is literally my chop. They call it a chop, but that's the signature, my signature in Japanese characters from when I lived there. Everyone take care.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Woohoo, we did it.
Yay!
We're still recording, by the way.
Yeah,
Woo.
I was gonna say make that the last part.
Oh, my bad.